We have actually done a proprietary study to understand the behavior change for the Chinese consumers during the lockdown period, and then what kind of behavior change actually lasted beyond the lockdown period.
That's Kiki Yang, co-head of Bain's private equity practice in the Asia-Pacific region, and she's been watching China's economic recovery closely. It almost looks like a return to business as usual.
The percentage of people who resumed work was as high as about 90%. About 20% of those are remote working, and then the rest are actually physically going back to where they're supposed to be, in office or factories.
But look closer, Kiki says, and you'll see some startling sea changes in the way people shop, work, and live.
In the cities like Shanghai and on the mainland, you will be given a green QR code. That means you can safely travel. So even if, let's say you're an employee of Bain company and you wanted to go back to our office in Shanghai, you need to have that QR code. Otherwise, you cannot actually have access to the office building.
Today on the show, Kiki and I will discuss what happens as an economy reopens for business and office workers are literally getting the green light to go back to work. I'm Hugh MacArthur, head of Bain's global private equity practice, and this is Dry Powder. You know, Kiki, the first thing I wanted to talk to you about was the reopening of business in China. Everyone's kind of wondering when the economy will open, and if it's open, what restrictions has the government actually lifted so far?
So there's almost no restriction in terms of intercity travel now across all mainland China. There is restrictions for airlines and hotels in terms of the capacity they can operate on. So for example, airlines are about 50%. Some of the tourist attractions could be as low as 30%, depending on which city we're talking about.
Are people actually leaving their homes with confidence as soon as these restrictions are lifted? And do you have any data from mobile data or commuter movements that actually tell us where people are going?
Yeah, the first couple of weeks, I think people are still very cautious. And especially if you think about when China lifted a lot of the restrictions on travel, the global trend was actually escalating. So the people were quite cautious. But then, especially in the month of April, we have seen actually pretty significant increase in traffic. So we've actually used big data in terms of tracking the shopping district traffic. In mid-March, only 40% of the traffic was back across different cities. But then I think that number about 2 weeks ago was 80% already across different tier cities in China.
The restrictions that are still in place, do they vary from one area in China to another, or are they all pretty standardized?
At this moment, they are quite consistent. At one point, the epicenter for this in Wuhan and the Hubei province was very, very strict versus the rest of China. If you look at the way that China reopened, it is a gradual process. A lot of the decisions are made at the provincial or even city level. Beijing was the last city that actually decreased the alarm level from 1 to 2, and that only happened on April 30th. Whereas a lot of the other tier 1 cities like Shenzhen and Shanghai actually reduced their level far before that.
But in terms of where people can go, what they can do, how they can go to work, those are all pretty much consistent across the entire country right now?
Yes, it is pretty consistent.
All right, well, let's take the opportunity to chat a little bit then about this new normal. How are shoppers behaving as they emerge from their houses?
So some of the interesting trends we have noticed was during the lockdown period, a lot of people were spending their time in terms of online entertainment, and that ranges from gaming, watching short videos, any kind of online entertainment, really. And that time spent was on average about 5.2 hours per person, and that is about 27% higher than before. But now actually coming out of the lockdown, we still saw about 9% increase in terms of the time allocation to digital entertainment. So that's the first thing that we've noticed that was a huge difference during the lockdown and something that actually changed even coming out of it. The second area that we have noticed is actually the indoor leisure activities, anything from people exercising to play mahjong as a family. That number was very high during the lockdown, so you can imagine. And some of that actually stayed. Also, some of the gyms are still not open, so people are, still using a lot of the apps for indoor exercise. And the third thing is actually working remote or studying remotely, right? I mean, I think that is something that really spiked during the lockdown, and now there's still quite a lot of people who are working remotely, and a lot of schools, if you're not a graduating class, you're probably still not in school, as China is still reopening schools gradually. And that is a provincial level decision as well.
That's quite a few behavioral shifts that you're describing. Let's stick with consumer behavior for a moment. Can you talk me through some examples of consumers going down, say, the adoption curve of e-commerce and how that has changed through the pandemic crisis?
Yes. When we looked at some of the interesting verticals, especially, let's say, e-commerce apps that are fresh grocery related, adoption of that kind of app spiked by about 70% during the lockdown. And now coming out of it, if you look across different platforms, they still retain about 20% of higher activities than prior to the crisis. And we're not talking about just younger generation. We're talking about really across different age groups. My parents, who are in their 70s, actually sign up to actually get fresh grocery delivered. It probably only took them a week.
So proof positive this is not just a millennial thing. Even your parents have joined the 21st century of consumers.
Absolutely. But I have to say, I think China was lucky enough that a lot of the delivery staff did not leave the major cities during the Chinese New Year period, which made a lot of this actually possible, right? And there's a higher penetration of e-commerce to begin with. And also, interesting enough, for the operators, customer acquisition costs used to be one of the highest costs for them. But I think since the lockdown period, and that acquisition cost has significantly declined, which means they can actually run a profitable model now.
So it's an increase in demand, and it's also yielding better unit economics for the grocery operation itself, you're saying?
Exactly.
Now, out in the physical world, as well as e-commerce, we know that businesses are rapidly innovating and changing as well. Have you seen any substantial redesign to the customer or employee experience?
Yes, absolutely. I think to talk about something extreme, the real estate market, normally you would expect the consumer to walk around, get a feeling of what they may be purchasing. And a lot of tours are actually online now. So it's really important for the developers to actually build the online capabilities to be able to have this 360 and almost very realistic experience for the potential purchases. And that kind of online to offline transition is extremely important in a lot of other sectors as well.
So it sounds like there's a lot of experimentation that's going on both in the physical world and obviously in the virtual world online to try and get consumers comfortable. And in fact, we know from prior Bain research that it only takes about 30 days for consumers to completely change their behavior. So I suspect we're going to see some really new behaviors and changes resulting from this. Could you, Kiki, walk me through or think about a case study that you might have dealt with recently of a business that's already adapted to this new normal?
So I think one of the example would be a leading quick service restaurant chain in China that was very quick in terms of adapting to the new normal. As of today, it's almost back to 100% of stores that are either partially or fully open. But the traffic, as you can imagine, is recovering slowly. However, when we actually look at the same store sales growth for the first quarter, it's only down by about 10%, which is actually surprising because during the lockdown, we saw actually about 45% same store sales growth decline. And that is because the delivery volume really doubled for that chain. For China, fortunately, we have a very high adoption in terms of online food delivery to begin with, even before the crisis. But definitely from an operations perspective, the stores are actually operating to cater more for the takeaway and for the delivery platforms to pick up the orders. So that was one of the things that restaurants have to do to offset some of the impact from the lockdown and where people are still being conservative from going back to dining in the restaurants.
Interesting. So Kiki, we just talked a lot about consumers, and you also made a couple of comments about people going back to work in offices and factories, and that 90% of people are actually now back to work. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about offices and factories. Are they really getting back to full capacity? Are they operating the way they were prior to the pandemic lockdown?
Yeah, for the manufacturing side, the difficulty was not trying to get people back to work. Migrant workers can actually get back to wherever the factories are. But the problem now is really the slowdown of demand. And a lot of the international transportation are slowing down or even coming to a halt. So that is really actually why a lot of the factories are not operating at their full capacity today. For the offices, we had a very recent conversation with one of our investor clients, and we talk about the fact that would there be more satellite office requirements now that people have seen remote working, could be possible, which is a really interesting question for a lot of the Type A office buildings. If you look at cities like Hong Kong, the vacancy rate is very high right now, given what is happening. So, would that be actually a very big behavior trend in the next couple of years? I think we'll have to see.
On the next episode of Dry Powder, Kiki and I will discuss the investment environment in China. Is it improving? Is it flat? Is it negative? What are we seeing from clients?
We have seen various funds becoming quite active. And if you think about the dry powder that we have in this part of the world, there's actually still quite a lot of capital that people wanted to put to work.
If you'd like to learn more about how you can tailor your firm's strategy to the COVID-19 crisis, email us at drypowder@bain.com. I'm Hugh MacArthur. Thank you for listening.